was at workings in that 73 Nationals, that there was a forming and a feeling that these great players needed to play for something more than t-shirts and trophies, and that money would begin the first event or first tour season of men's professional racquetball, all because of the great dynamic of the 73 amateur nationals. And boy, when the fall came around in September and the first pro event was announced in Houston, it was a monumental breakthrough for racquetball. I could remember that the players had to sign professional contracts to participate. And on the front cover of the magazine was Charlie Brumfield in the office of Leach Industries at the time, signing a professional contract to participate, and was kind of recognized that he was the first one to sign, but really he wasn't, because just a few minutes prior to that was Steve Keeley, who signed his professional contract. But because Charlie Brumfield was kind of like the perennial great champion, he was on the front cover. And everyone thought this pro tour was going to be free money for Charlie Brumfield because he was so much better than everybody else. And boy, he was just going to make money hand over fist playing professional racquetball because nobody could touch him. Well, when the tour started, there was a lot of different synergies going on for different players preparing to play. And boy, was there huge surprises in the first 3 professional events. The birth of professional racquetball, of the first professional racquetball event in 73 in the fall. Houston was the host city, and it was the Houston YMCA with those old-fashioned concrete walls that play a little bit faster and could have had a little bit of a factor in who won the event. But coming into the event, it was Charlie Brumfield against the field. I mean, everybody looked at that event as, who is going to get second place prize money. And boy, were a lot of people surprised. Prior to the event, Steve Strandemo practiced with Charlie Brumfield. Brumfield kind of used Steve Strandemo to practice because Steve was the most conditioned, the athlete who felt like he had to get himself in such incredible physical condition in order to play his game at the highest level. And Charlie loved the fact that he was in such great shape because he could run him unmercifully in practice along not only practicing, game strategy at a pro level, but also in Strandemo's absolute determination in playing very, very hard in the practice. But that could have been Brumfield's downfalls of underestimating Strandemo's game. Coming into the event, Steve Keeley, who was the second favorite, was coming off some of the worst ever, according to Chuck Hanna, the MD of the Pro Tour, who treated Steve Keeley, saying it was the second worst case of mononucleosis that he had ever seen. 1 week after coming off the couch, because nobody was going to miss the first professional racquetball tournament. And Steve Keeley came into that event when a lot of people didn't know the severity of his condition, but still Steve Keeley did some pretty miraculous things. Every player came from all over the country and hoping to win what was going to be a monumental first event. As the tournament started to move through and players beat the players they were supposed to beat, came into the quarterfinals for the final 8 players. Steve Strandemo, who was always highly regarded, but not really so much of a serious threat, ran up against his practice partner, Charlie Brumfield. And in the other quarterfinal, some of the quarterfinal matches, you had Steve Serot, who was barreling through the draw, whose game was extremely well suited with those faster all-cement courts. And Bill Schmidtke, the veteran, was playing at an extremely high level, to where there was a lot of intrigue as to who was going to make it into the top 4. Well, one of the early matches of the quarterfinals was Charlie Brumfield against Steve Strandemo. And that proved to be one of the most brutally long, hard matches ever seen played. Strandemo played at a level that he must have learned that he was going to have to develop during those practice sessions. I actually believe those practice sessions were everything to Steve Strandemo's ability to play Charlie Brumfield at a level that would become extremely uncomfortable for Brumfield. And as they fought basically hour after hour, and that YMCA was a little bit warmer than normal because of that, maybe the air conditioning. They did talk about how there was a lot of humidity there. Brumfield developed cramps in a match that, from when the time they started, got worse and worse and worse as Strandemo continued the severe pounding and long rallies, to where Brumfield had to call it quits because he could barely walk in a huge upset of an event. Huge upset. Steve Strandemo moved on to the semifinals. And there was also a dynamic going on in that tournament, because Steve Keeley and Charlie Brumfield were the only 2 players that Steve Serad had never beaten, but was still kind of favored a little bit over Serad. And one of the key ones was Brumfield, who was now knocked out of the draw on the same side as Steve Serad. So as Serad moved on to the semis, he would meet Steve Strandemo. In the upper top part of the bracket, you had Steve Keeley, who faced a very tough opponent in Jerry Halacher, and even a week off the bed and tough mononucleosis, Steve Keeley still found the wherewithal to outlast Halacher in a very, very tough, difficult match to move on to the semis, as Bill Schmidtke did. And at that stage of their careers, Bill Schmidtke had never beaten Steve Keeley, and Steve Strandemo, coming off of a huge win, was looked at as maybe as a possible threat that he could come up with an equally tough game against Serot. But Serot was having none of it and totally destroyed Steve Strandemo in the semifinal match, in beating him in single digits both games and moving on to the finals. In the other semifinal match, with Steve Keeley still really at maybe 50%, him and Bill Schmidtke had an incredibly tough match, going all the way down to the wire, splitting the first 2 games and going down to 20-20 in the tiebreaker, where Bill Schmidtke, the guy who we've always talked about, who would play the biggest points, the toughest, found a victory shot to move on and win that semifinal round into the finals with a victory, his first victory ever, over Steve Keeley. And understand, in 20 matches of competition, that was the only time during his career that he beat Steve Keeley. So here it was, the finals of the first men's pro event, featuring a veteran of great shots, great strategy, and the best big point player against this young, hard-hitting, athletic phenom kid from St. Louis. And Steve Serot knew that all the stars had aligned for him. He had the court. He had the concrete court, which made the pace of the game a little bit more to his favoring. He had his two big nemesis knocked out of the draw in Charlie Brumfield and in Steve Keeley. And playing against Bill Schmidtke, even though it was no joke, was a lot more palatable for Serad than those other two would have been. And he was coming off rolling Steve Strandemo in the semis, so he had a lot of confidence. The first game was a very tough, nip and tuck, very competitive first game, going all the way down to the wire at 20 all. After a number of times coming in and out at 20, Serot came up with the shot to win that first game, and almost kind of like, not break the will, but it was a big, big game. Maybe one of the biggest games of his career to win, because that momentum came out. And in the second game, Steve Serot rolled and won that second game 21-10 to win the first pro event in racquetball. And I can remember when Steve came back to the J in St. Louis after winning it, it was like he was just different. Everything was like different. He was now a professional racquetball player. I mean, there just was like kind of more of a glow about him and about his success and everything, and beginning to launch his career at a perfect time to where he is so young, a 17-year-old, coming into when all of a sudden now the sport is going to start paying you. So Steve Serad had nothing but an incredibly bright future ahead and was truly a huge superstar. But what would happen with Brumfield as the second tournament rolled around? There was nobody who thought they were going to bet against Charlie Brumfield. The second event on the Pro Tour moved to California to the Long Beach Athletic Club. And there was a lot of storyline coming into that. As I talked before, Charlie Brumfield was not to be denied a victory in Long Beach. A matter of fact, it had been a year and a half before he had lost a match when he lost by cramps to Steve Strandemo in the first tournament. So there was no way he was going to lose the second event. Well, maybe Steve Keeley had a little bit of something to say about that. But as the event formed out in Long Beach, the draw stayed very similar to the 73 Nationals, to where Steve Serot and Charlie Brumfield were on one side of the draw, and Steve Keeley and Bill Schmidtke were on the other side of the draw. A footnote to the semifinals, to where all four of those players moved on to, Steve Strandemo drew Steve Serot in the quarters and fought him real hard, as Steve won that match in 3 games against Strandemo to move on to the semifinals, meeting Charlie Brumfield. In the other semifinal, we talked about Bill Schmidtke and Steve Keeley met again in the semifinals. But there was a different storyline in that event. Steve Keeley, coming into the Long Beach event, was probably more determined than ever in his life to win an event than Long Beach. Number one, he was coming off of mono in that first event, beating a lot of tough players to get to the semifinals and barely losing to Schmidtke, but he was determined more than ever to win that event. And if you know anything about Steve Keeley, when he gets determination behind his game, he could be very difficult to stop. And here Charlie Brumfield makes it on through to the semifinals to play Steve Serot, who, you know, that was a match that everybody was pointing to that could be a lot of finals in the future because of how great Serot was. And Serot was the winner of that first tournament. And they went on to have a very, very tough first game, a tough second game. But Brumfield, as I said before, hasn't lost 2 matches in a row. Didn't lose a match before the last pro event for over a year and a half. And he found a way to beat Serad pretty convincingly and very solid in that third game to move on to the finals. In the other semifinal, you had a rematch of the first semifinal of the first event in Schmidtke and Keeley playing. Now, as I told you before, Keeley came into that tournament literally cruising through. He had to play Jerry Halischer in the quarterfinals and beat Jerry very, very solid. Coming into the semifinal, everybody thought that was going to be the match of the tournament. Not with Keeley's determination of really instilling himself as the best player in the world, but he wanted to win that one very badly. And he pretty much had his way in beating Bill Schmidtke 2 straight games in a very, very solid way. 21-10, 21-12. So here comes the finals against the 2 biggest names with the 2 biggest games. And can Charlie Brumfield lose the considered the most important tournament ever in the history of racquetball against a guy who was determined to give everything he had with the remembrance of the earlier 73 Nationals that he had lost to Brumfield? That was the match before in a very, very difficult game, tough 3-gamer with a lot of intimidation to win. Well, Steve Keeley came out in that final and played at a level never seen before against Charlie Brumfield and beat him like he's never been beat before and maybe never since, winning 21-7, 21-18, 2 straight to win the second pro event in stunning fashion. First, Brumfield had lost the first 2 pro events, who everyone thought was going to be the 2 easiest victories by any pro at that level. But Steve Keeley and Steve Serot, 2 new winners, had come in and won the first 2 big events. Now the tour moved on to the 3rd event. And could it be possible that Brumfield wouldn't win one of the first 3 events? Well, the answer was no, because Brumfield came out and finally won that 3rd professional event and reinstilled himself as the best player in the world. We move on to the 3rd event of the first year of professional racquetball. And this proved to be a very, very big event, huge event for racquetball. As finally Charlie Brumfield breaks through in that event, but not easily. The difficulty of the draw and of all these draws, it was to say how deep they were and how tough some of the early round matches of those events were. So as the draw began to take form into the semis, you had the matchup at the top of Steve Serot being ranked 1, Bill Schmidtke being ranked 4th, Steve Keeley being ranked 2nd, and Charlie Brumfield being ranked 3rd. Now, Charlie Brumfield hadn't been ranked third like forever. And I believe that also, too, was a bit of incentive for him to get that victory. Very important for him to get that victory and stuff. So Steve Serot played Bill Schmidtke in the first semifinal, playing great, playing at a level and in consistency in the first two pro events, really instilling himself as one of the top 2 or 3 best players in the world in beating Bill Schmidtke and moving on to the finals. And a funny thing happened along the way in the bottom bracket, that in the quarterfinals, Steve Strandemo drew Steve Keeley, who he had been playing with and practicing with, and also Steve Keeley had been teaching Steve Strandemo elements of instruction of racquetball, to where maybe just like Brumfield, a little underestimating Steve Strandemo's determination to becoming one of the best players in the sport, found a way to break through and to beat Steve Keeley for one of the very few times that he ever beat him in his career, to move on to the semifinals to face Charlie Brumfield. Now, in the semifinals between Brumfield and Strandemo, they were tough, contested games, but Brumfield definitely had the advantage against Strandemo and was not going to lose to Strandemo 2 times in a row, having lost to him in that first tournament. Brumfield found a way to beat Strandemo pretty solidly to move on to his first final. In the other semifinal, Serot played Schmidtke, and in a tough match, but in a way, Steve Serot was kind of like getting a dominance over an older of the top 4, top 6 group, Bill Schmidtke, to where his game style was very, very difficult for Bill to kind of overcome. And Serot had his way in a pretty solid way of moving on to the finals between him and Charlie Brumfield, which was at the time the greatest rivalry in men's professional racquetball. But in the finals, as I said, this was a very, very important match for Brumfield. So the final match between Steve Serot and Charlie Brumfield, an epic matchup of 2 of the greats of the early years of professional racquetball. Another thing I want to point out about the matches in those days is how long the rallies were. There were no quick 1-2 shots, very rarely in those days, of winning a point. They were long, strategized rallies that went on 20, 30 shots and sometimes even longer. And the physical nature of the sport is everybody who played was in incredible physical conditioning. And a lot of players, almost everyone, you couldn't get the fitness level by just playing. You had to do a lot of off-court running, training, cycling, everything to boost your cardiovascular fitness, because you were out there running for 2.5, sometimes 3 hours in the finals of a match that Lord knows you were running close to a marathon when you were in those brutal, long rallies. So the finals breaks down with Serot and Brumfield playing the first game, very tough, very competitive, close game, with Brumfield winning around a 21-17 victory in game 1. In game 2, the same kind of game, very tough, very physical game. And I remember in those days, Serot used to dive many times. And every time you dove and had to get up off that floor, it was very tough and wearing on you. But Serot found a way of winning that second game in equal fashion around 21-18. The third game was going to be a little bit different because this was a game that was probably one of the most important games of Charlie Brumfield's career. He needed to win that game in the worst way, and he did. And he did in pretty dominant and controlling fashion. So here we had the first three most important events of men's professional racquetball won by three of its greatest champions, which really catapulted popularity amongst the fan base because it was a huge fan base that was following Charlie Brumfield. There was a totally different fan base that followed Steve Keeley, who was the California great-looking guy with the great looks and everything that represented a professional athlete. And then you had Steve Serad, who was the wonder kid of that time of professional racquetball, and really the guy who all of us young players kind of aspired to, that yes, at an early age we can have success because this guy, Steve Serot, was the guy who kind of paved the way for that, hey, us younger generation with a real aggressive, hard-hitting style can compete with the grand masters of the game, who really, in my opinion, laid the groundwork for not only for professional racquetball, but for the development of the sport of racquetball. Steve Keeley's instructional articles, his ability to teach racquetball, and not only to teach racquetball to the masses, but to teach racquetball and to teach other pros how to teach racquetball was incredibly important. That actually landed Steve Keeley, in my opinion, the very first teaching pro job at Mel Gorham's way back in the day. And a lot of players, such as Bud Muehlheisen and a lot of Mike Zeitman and a lot of the greats, sort of actually pointed that to Steve Keeley as being the best person to teach the sport of racquetball because of his understanding of not only of strokes, shots, game strategy, and with a competitive kind of a way about him of elevating people's games with better knowledge. He was so instrumental in racquetball and in the future of racquetball. So here we had the three titans of the game who brought racquetball to the forefront in sports that were uniquely different and followed uniquely different by fans of the sport of racquetball. That was just a tremendous influence on a lot of players, especially me. You know, I saw these guys as bigger than life and also created an opportunity that, okay, the beginning of pro racquetball was going to lead to other bigger and better things for the exposure of the sport, not only in the prize money aspect, but in TV, in visibility, in celebrity that we have never seen before, all by the great three pioneers of professional racquetball.